never get it right. Kids like you are hopeless." The sound of faint laughter in the background. A pencil drops. Silence lingers. One word, that's all it took to shatter a boy's spirit. In a crowded classroom with 30 pairs of eyes on him, a young student's hope was crushed by the very person meant to guide him. That boy's name was Elijah Noah. And what happened in that moment would shape the rest of his life. But the story doesn't end there. Because sometimes, the very words meant to bury us become the seeds that push us to rise. This is his story. The clock ticked louder than usual, as if it wanted to escape the classroom just as badly as every child sitting in those rows of wooden desks. The fluorescent lights hummed above, flickering now and then, casting a pale glow on 30 restless students. Pencils tapped, shoes shuffled, and outside, the sun leaned toward afternoon. But inside that room, time felt frozen. In the middle row sat a boy named Elijah Noah. His eyes were sharp, curious, but his spirit was quiet. He wasn't the loudest in the room, nor the smartest in the eyes of others, but he carried a deep hunger to be seen, to be heard, to be taken seriously. His notebook was filled with scribbles, doodles, and half-written answers, each one a small spark of his determination. That day, the lesson was math. Miss Carter, the teacher, moved across the chalkboard, her hand dragging equations in white dust that screeched against the surface. She was strict, known for her sharp tongue and her colder-than-ice stares. Few dared to challenge her. Fewer still dared to speak unless they were absolutely certain. But Elijah had been studying the night before. Long after his mother had gone to bed, long after the streets outside his window had gone silent, he sat under the weak light of a thrift store lamp, repeating equations until his eyes blurred. And now, when Miss Carter turned from the chalkboard and asked the class a question, Elijah felt his heart pound. He knew this one. He knew it. His arm lifted slowly, trembling but determined. For a moment the classroom stilled. His hand hovered in the air like a fragile flame against the wind. Inside, his heart whispered, "This is it. Today I'll prove I can do it. Today she'll see me." But Miss Carter's eyes cut across the room like blades and landed on him. "Elijah," she said, her voice slicing through the silence. "Why are you even bothering?" The words froze him. "You'll never get it right. Kids like you." She let the words hang for a moment, then finished with a cruel certainty. "Kids like you are hopeless." The silence that followed was louder than thunder. For a heartbeat, the entire class sat frozen. Then, from the back of the room, a chuckle broke the stillness. Another laugh followed. Soon the sound spread, not everyone, but enough. Enough to make Elijah's ears burn and his cheeks flush red with shame. The pencil slipped from his sweaty fingers, clattering to the floor. He wanted to dive under his desk, vanish into the cracks in the tiles. His chest felt tight, his throat ached, but he forced himself to stay still. He couldn't cry, not here, not in front of them. Hopeless. The word repeated in his head, over and over, drowning out the laughter, drowning out everything. Hopeless. Slowly, he lowered his hand, the courage that had taken all night to build collapsing in a single moment. His gaze dropped to the page in front of him, though he could no longer see the numbers he had written. His vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. Miss Carter didn't stop. She turned back to the board, as if she hadn't just crushed a child in front of everyone. She kept writing equations, her voice steady and uncaring. Then, almost casually, she added, "You'll thank me one day for being honest." Honest. That word cut even deeper. To Elijah, it wasn't honesty. It was a curse, a sentence passed down by someone who was supposed to guide him. Her words weren't meant to correct him. They were meant to cage him. The bell rang at last, shrill and freeing. Chairs screeched against the floor, backpacks zipped, and the classroom emptied with the chaos of children eager to leave. But Elijah moved slowly, too heavy to run. He gathered his books with trembling hands, waiting until the laughter and footsteps had faded. When he finally stood, the room felt bigger, emptier, colder. He walked out into the hallway, but the echo of her voice followed him like a shadow. Hopeless. Hopeless. Even the sound of other children laughing down the corridor twisted into mockery in his ears. He walked home with his head low, clutching his books tight against his chest like a shield. The streets were cracked, the air cool with autumn, but his face burned with humiliation. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though he was dragging the weight of her words behind him. And when he reached his front door, one thought consumed him more than any other. Maybe she was right. Maybe he really was hopeless. Elijah shut the door behind him and leaned against it, letting the quiet of his small home wrap around him. The walls carried the faint scent of his mother's cooking, the sound of a creaky fan humming from the living room. But none of it comforted him. The words still rang in his head like a cruel bell. Hopeless. He dropped his backpack onto the couch and sank beside it. His hands pressed into his face, palms rough against damp skin. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the sting of her words, the humiliation, the laughter, the heat that had burned his cheeks while the whole class watched him shrink. But soon, the front door opened again. His mother stepped inside, carrying a bag of groceries. Her tired eyes lit up when she saw him, the corners of her lips rising into a weary but gentle smile. "Hey, baby," she said softly. "How was school today?" Elijah's chest tightened. The truth sat on the edge of his tongue, but he swallowed it back. He didn't want her to know. He didn't want her to worry. "It was fine," he muttered, forcing a small shrug. She studied him for a moment, as mothers do, searching his face for answers his words wouldn't give. But she didn't press. Instead, she set down the bag, kissed the top of his head, and disappeared into the kitchen. Elijah sat there, silent. Fine. That was the lie he had chosen. But inside, he didn't feel fine. He felt crushed, invisible, defeated. That night, he opened his notebook again. The pages stared back at him, filled with half-solved equations and scrawled notes. Normally, he'd dive back in, pencil in hand, determination burning. But tonight, his hand froze. The pencil slipped from his grasp. He could still hear her voice. "Kids like you are hopeless." What if she was right? The thought gnawed at him. Maybe he wasn't smart enough. Maybe no amount of studying would change the fact that he would always fall behind. Maybe he wasn't meant to be anything more than what people expected him to be. Nothing. The pencil rolled off the desk, landing softly on the carpet. He didn't bother to pick it up. Instead, he crawled into bed, pulling the blanket over his head. His chest felt heavy. His mind replayed the scene, each detail sharper, crueler. The way her eyes narrowed, the laughter of his classmates, the silence afterward. Hopeless! He hated the word, but it clung to him, wrapped around him like a chain he couldn't break. The days that followed weren't much better. Elijah still went to class, still sat in his usual spot in the middle row. But he stopped raising his hand. He stopped trying to speak up. When Miss Carter asked questions, he kept his gaze on the desk. When homework was handed back, he took his papers quietly, ignoring the red marks scattered across them. He didn't want to give her another chance to humiliate him. He didn't want to risk hearing that word again. Hopeless. It echoed in every moment, even when she wasn't speaking, even when the classroom was silent. Outside of school, his friends noticed the change. The boy who used to share jokes, who used to chase basketballs down the cracked pavement of the neighborhood court, now sat quietly on the sidelines. They teased him at first, then grew frustrated, then stopped asking him to play altogether. And Elijah? He didn't fight it. He let the distance grow. Because maybe Carter was right. Maybe there was no point. One afternoon, he sat on the steps outside the school, watching the other kids laugh and run across the yard. His notebook lay on his lap, untouched. The wind flipped the pages as if urging him to write, to try, but he couldn't. Not anymore. For the first time in his young life, he felt small. Truly small, like a shadow fading into the corner of a room. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Elijah whispered the word out loud, testing its shape on his tongue. Hopeless. The sound of it made his chest ache. His eyes burned, but he refused to cry. Instead, he made himself a quiet promise. If that was who he was destined to be, if hopeless was all he would ever be, then he would accept it. He would stop fighting, stop trying, stop believing. At least that's what he thought in that moment. But deep down, in a place even he couldn't recognize yet, the word wasn't just a chain. It was a seed. And though it had been planted in pain, seeds have a way of growing. Elijah didn't know it yet, but the very thing meant to break him was already shaping him, already pushing him toward something greater. It started small, almost unnoticeable. Weeks after the incident in class, Elijah found himself in the library. He hadn't gone there to study, not really. He had wandered in to escape the noise of the cafeteria, the laughter of other kids that felt sharper than knives. The smell of old paper and polished wood calmed him in a way he couldn't explain. He walked slowly through the rows of shelves, dragging his fingertips across the spines of books, until one slipped loose and fell into his hands. He glanced down. The cover read, "The Autobiography of Malcolm X." He turned it over, curious. The image of Malcolm stared back at him, firm and defiant. Elijah hesitated, then carried the book to a table in the corner. Page after page, his eyes widened. The words felt like fire, alive with struggle and determination. Malcolm's story wasn't easy. It was full of setbacks, failures, and pain. But it was also full of power, the kind of power that comes from refusing to stay down. For the first time in weeks, Elijah felt something stirring inside him. A question he couldn't shake. If Malcolm could rise from nothing, why couldn't I? The thought terrified him, but it also gave him something he thought he had lost. A spark. From that day, Elijah returned to the library often. He devoured stories of leaders, inventors, writers, fighters, men and women who had been told no but had carved out a yes. People who had been labeled less, but who proved themselves more. Each story whispered the same truth. Hopeless was a lie. Still, the struggle wasn't over. In the classroom, Miss Carter remained the same. Cold, sharp, dismissing him with glances that cut deeper than words. He still didn't raise his hand, still avoided attention. But inside, something was shifting. He began to write in secret. Not homework, not the equations he was too weary to solve under her gaze, but thoughts, reflections, questions, whole pages filled with messy handwriting, sometimes angry, sometimes hopeful. His notebook became more than paper. It became his shield, his weapon, his hidden voice. At night, when the house was quiet, he'd whisper to himself, "I am not hopeless. I am not hopeless." The words didn't always feel true. Some nights they sounded hollow, fragile, like glass about to break. But other nights they felt strong, almost unshakable. One evening, while Elijah sat at the kitchen table scribbling in his notebook, his mother walked in. She glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "You've been writing a lot lately," she said. Elijah shrugged, embarrassed. "It's nothing." She smiled softly. "Doesn't look like nothing to me." He paused, unsure of how to respond. But in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in weeks. Belief. Quiet, steady belief, and for a moment it made him believe too. "The next day at school, miss," Carter gave another cutting remark, this time about his messy homework. Elijah stayed quiet, staring at his desk. But something inside him whispered, "Not forever. One day you'll see." The seed had begun to take root. It grew stronger when a substitute teacher filled in for a week. Unlike Ms. Carter, this teacher noticed Elijah's silence and gently encouraged him to answer. At first, Elijah resisted, too afraid of failing. But the substitute was patient, never mocking, never harsh. And when Elijah finally whispered an answer one afternoon, shaky but correct, the substitute smiled. "Good job, Elijah. I knew you had it in you." The words were simple. But to Elijah, they were everything. It was the first time in weeks he felt seen. The first time he felt the label of hopeless crack. Just a little. That night, he stayed up late again. Not because he was afraid of failing, but because he wanted to succeed. He wanted to feel that spark again. Hopeless was no longer the only word echoing in his mind. Now, there was another. Possible. The word echoed in Elijah's chest, soft at first, then stronger with each passing day. It wasn't a roar, not yet. More like a whisper that refused to be silenced. But even whispers can grow loud when repeated enough times. Elijah began to test himself again. Slowly, carefully, as if stepping onto thin ice. He stayed up at night with his notebook, not just scribbling thoughts anymore, but working through equations, reading chapters, underlining words he didn't understand until he did. He stopped throwing his mistakes away. Instead, he studied them, determined to see where he had gone wrong. For every page filled with red marks, he filled 2 more with corrections. The next math quiz came, and though his stomach twisted with nerves, Elijah took his time. When the graded papers were returned, his hands shook as he turned his over. A bold B stared back at him. Not perfect, but not failure, not hopeless. His heart raced. It wasn't about the grade, it was about proof. Proof that effort mattered, that maybe, just maybe, he was capable after all. For the first time in months, Elijah smiled in class. Miss Carter, however, remained unmoved. She glanced at the paper, lips tightening, as if she wanted to dismiss his progress. And she did. "A B isn't an A, Elijah," she said flatly, handing the quiz back. "Don't celebrate mediocrity." The words stung, but they didn't crush him the way they once would have. This time, the whisper of possible drowned out her voice. At home, his mother noticed the change. Elijah's late nights at the table. The pages filled with calculations and essays, the determination in his eyes. She didn't need to say much. Just her steady presence, her quiet nods, were enough to fuel him. By the end of the semester, Elijah's grades were climbing, not only in math but across every subject. He wasn't at the top of the class, not yet, but he was rising faster than anyone expected, except himself. And with each small victory, his confidence grew. He started speaking up again, carefully at first, then with more certainty. When a question was asked, his hand sometimes lifted. And when he got the answer right, the old humiliation began to loosen its grip. But the real turning point came one spring afternoon. The school announced an essay competition. The theme was simple, but profound. Words have power. Elijah froze when he read the prompt. The irony wasn't lost on him. He knew better than anyone how much power words could carry. One word had nearly broken him. But now, maybe, words could set him free. He poured himself into the essay, his pen racing across the pages. He wrote about the sting of labels, about how a single cruel word can silence a child, but how words of encouragement can spark fire in the coldest heart. He didn't name Miss Carter. He didn't need to. The truth was already woven into every sentence. When he finished, he sat back, tears blurring his vision. For the first time, his pain had become more than just weight. It had become fuel. Weeks later, the winners were announced in the school auditorium. Elijah sat in the crowd, palms sweaty, trying not to hope too much. And first place, the principal announced, goes to Elijah Noah. The room erupted in applause. Elijah's classmates turned to look at him, their eyes wide. Some clapped sincerely, others in disbelief. He stood, heart pounding, and walked to the stage. As he accepted the small trophy and the folded certificate, the principal smiled warmly. "You have a gift, Elijah. Don't ever forget that." The words landed in his heart like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He glanced toward the back of the auditorium. There stood Miss Carter, arms crossed, expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes met. Her gaze wavered just slightly before she looked away. Elijah didn't need her approval anymore. The seed she had planted with cruelty had grown into something she could no longer control. He stepped off the stage, the certificate in his hand, and whispered to himself one last time. Not hopeless. Never hopeless. Years passed. The boy who once sat in the middle row, shrinking under the weight of a single word, was no longer the same. Elijah Noah had grown. Through late nights, endless work, and battles fought both in classrooms and within himself, he built a future brick by brick. College came, not easy but earned. Degrees followed. Then leadership roles. Step after step, his determination carved a path no one had believed possible. And now, years later, Elijah sat behind a polished desk in a spacious office. His nameplate gleamed. Elijah Noah, Principal. The office smelled faintly of books and coffee, sunlight streaming in through tall windows. On the wall hung framed certificates, awards, and photographs, not of himself, but of students smiling with diplomas in their hands. Each picture was a reminder of why he worked, why he had endured, why he had refused to be hopeless. This was his school now, his responsibility, his chance to be the voice he once needed. A knock sounded at the door. "Come in," Elijah said, his tone steady, professional. The door opened, and in walked a woman. Her hair streaked with gray, her posture still rigid, though not as commanding as he remembered. Time had softened her face, but her eyes, sharp, assessing, were unmistakable. It was Miss Carter. For a heartbeat, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Memories flashed, the chalkboard, the laughter, the word that had haunted him. But Elijah's expression remained calm, controlled. She cleared her throat, clutching a folder. "Principal Noah," she began, her voice polite, almost rehearsed. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm here to apply for the open teaching position." The words hung in the air like a twist of fate. Elijah gestured toward the chair across from him. "Have a seat." She sat, smoothing her skirt, her hands tightening around the folder. I've heard wonderful things about this school. I believe my years of experience could be of great value here." Elijah studied her quietly. His mind replayed the moment she had branded him hopeless, the sound of laughter filling his ears all over again. He could still see his young self, lowering his hand, his spirit crushed. But now the roles were reversed. The boy she dismissed as nothing sat in the chair of authority, while she waited nervously for his judgment. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Carter, do you believe words have power?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Of course. Teachers use words every day to shape young minds." He nodded slowly. "That's true. Words can build, or they can destroy. Do you remember that?" Her brows furrowed. "I'm not sure what you mean." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "Years ago, in your classroom, you told a student he was hopeless, that he'd never amount to anything. For the first time, her composure cracked. She shifted in her seat, eyes darting to the side. I don't recall the details. Children exaggerate. Sometimes tough love is necessary." "Tough love?" Elijah interrupted gently but firmly. "Or was it carelessness?" Silence. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the space between them. Finally she spoke, her voice softer now. Perhaps I was too harsh. If I said something like that, it wasn't right." Elijah leaned back, studying her. His heart pounded, but his face remained steady. Inside, he wrestled with two voices, the wounded child who longed for vindication, and the man who had learned the strength of forgiveness. After a long pause, he said, "That student you called hopeless was me." Her eyes widened. For the first time, the sharp, unshakable Ms. Carter looked small. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling for words. "Elijah," she whispered. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," he said quietly. "But I knew. I carried your words with me for years. They nearly broke me, but they also fueled me. Every late night, every step forward, I heard your voice in my head, and I refused to let it be the truth." Tears welled in her eyes. She lowered her gaze, shame washing over her. Elijah let the silence stretch, heavy but necessary. Then he stood, walking to the window, looking out at the schoolyard where children played. "When I became principal, I made myself a promise," he said. "No child who walks into this school will ever be made to feel hopeless. Not by anyone. Not ever again." He turned back to face her, his expression firm, resolute. "I'm not sure you're the right fit for this position. This school is about building, not breaking, about lifting, not crushing, and I can't risk placing someone here who doesn't understand the weight of their words." Her lips trembled. She nodded slowly, the reality sinking in. She gathered her folder, stood, and whispered, "I understand." As she reached the door, Elijah added softly, "Miss Carter, I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." She paused, her shoulders sagging, then stepped out, closing the door behind her. Elijah stood alone in his office, breathing deeply. The boy who was once hopeless had grown into the man who chose hope, not only for himself, but for every child who would walk those halls after him. And for the first time, he felt the full weight of his journey. He had turned pain into purpose. Hopeless? Never hopeless. Elijah sat alone in his office, the echoes of the past finally quiet. The word that once haunted him had lost its power. What remained was not pain, but purpose. He thought of the boy who once lowered his hand in shame, the boy who almost believed he was nothing, and he thought of the countless other children who might be carrying wounds from words spoken carelessly. That was why he fought, why he worked, why he refused to let history repeat itself. Because words matter. They can break, they can build, they can bury, or they can plant seeds that grow into something extraordinary. Elijah chose to make his words a ladder, not a cage, to remind every student who walked into his school that they were possible, that they mattered, that hope was stronger than doubt. The teacher who once called him hopeless had been wrong. Elijah wasn't hopeless. He was proof that resilience could rewrite destiny, and as long as he breathed, no child under his care would ever feel the way he once did. Hopeless? Number. Always hopeful. Always possible. Have you also been made or marred with words by anyone in the past? Let's know in the comment. Also, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more inspiring stories worth telling.